I was sitting at my sister's medical school graduation dinner when her study partner Jake pulled up the CDC website on his phone. My family had just finished mocking government bureaucrats while shooting disappointed looks at me, the daughter who couldn't even finish nursing school. But then Jake's face went white as he stared at his screen, then at me, stammering, "Wait, Dr. Chen, you're the CDC director?" The entire table fell silent as my family realized the daughter they'd written off as a failure had been quietly running the nation's disease prevention for 4 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and for the past 4 years I've served as director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But to my family, I'm just Sarah, the disappointment who dropped out of nursing school and supposedly works some vague government desk job that never seems to pay well enough for nice clothes or a fancy apartment. I hadn't been home to Portland in 6 months, but my younger sister Emma's medical school graduation was impossible to avoid. The celebration dinner was at Meridian, one of those upscale restaurants where the wine costs more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Everyone looked polished and successful. My parents glowing with pride, Emma radiant in her cap and gown, her classmates already talking about their residency placements at prestigious hospitals. I sat quietly at the end of the long table, wearing a simple black dress from Target, trying to blend into the background. But family dinners have a way of putting a spotlight exactly where you don't want it. "Sarah still works for the government," my mother explained to Jake, Emma's study partner, with the tone she might use to describe a chronic illness. "Some health department thing? Very stable." The way she said stable made it sound like code for mediocre, but at least she's employed. My father chimed in while cutting his steak. "At least someone has to do the paperwork jobs. Not everyone can be a doctor like Emma." He smiled proudly at my sister, then glanced at me with what I'd learned to recognize as disappointment masked as acceptance. The truth was more complicated. I had actually finished nursing school, graduated summa cum laude in fact, then completed my master's in public health, followed by a PhD in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins. I'd spent years tracking disease outbreaks, coordinating international health responses, and developing protocols that had saved thousands of lives during the last pandemic. But my family didn't know any of that. To them, I was the daughter who'd changed her mind about medicine and settled for something less demanding. They thought I'd given up on my dreams and taken an easy government job with decent benefits and early retirement. The irony was suffocating. "The health department," Jake said politely, trying to include me in the conversation. "That must be interesting work. Are you involved with any of the recent disease surveillance programs?" I smiled vaguely. Something like that. Emma jumped in to redirect attention back to her achievements. "Jake's going into infectious disease medicine. He's been following all the latest CDC protocols during his rotation. Really fascinating stuff about contact tracing and outbreak management." My Uncle Robert snorted. "Government protocols. Half those bureaucrats have probably never seen a real patient. They sit in their air-conditioned offices making rules for people who actually do the work." "Robert," my mother warned gently, glancing at me with embarrassment. "What? I'm not wrong. These agency directors make 6 figures to write memos that real medical professionals have to follow. Meanwhile, Sarah here probably makes 1/3 of what Emma will earn as a resident." The familiar knot tightened in my stomach. I'd heard variations of this conversation at every family gathering for years. The assumption that I'd settled for less, aimed lower, chosen the easier path. They had no idea that my easy government job involved 18-hour days during health crises, congressional testimony, and decisions that affected millions of people. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to breathe. In the mirror, I saw a woman who looked tired, not from incompetence, but from carrying the weight of responsibility while pretending to be ordinary. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message about the emerging situation in Seattle that would likely dominate my next week, but I silenced it quickly. When I returned to the table, the conversation had moved to Emma's upcoming residency at Massachusetts General. More pride, more accomplishment, more evidence of the success I supposedly lacked. I smiled and nodded in all the right places, playing the supportive older sister, while my actual work remained invisible, classified, and utterly misunderstood by the people I loved most. What my family didn't know was that 3 days earlier, I'd been in the Situation Room at the White House, briefing the president on an emerging avian flu outbreak that had the potential to become the next global pandemic. While they thought I was pushing papers at some local health department, I was actually coordinating a multi-agency response involving the WHO, state health departments, and international partners across 4 continents. The, quote, government desk job they mocked was actually one of the most demanding positions in federal health leadership. My days began at 5 a.m. with intelligence briefings on global disease surveillance. I regularly testified before Congress, managed a budget of over $8 billion, and oversaw 15,000 employees working in laboratories, field offices, and international posts around the world. When they assumed I'd dropped out of nursing school because medicine was too hard, the truth was that I'd been recruited directly into a CDC fellowship program during my final semester. The agency had offered me a fast-track pathway to epidemiological research that most medical students could only dream of. I'd accepted, completed my advanced degrees, and spent years in the field investigating outbreaks from Ebola in West Africa to MERS in the Middle East. The simple black dress I wore tonight? It came from Target because I'd learned that expensive clothes were impractical when you might need to board a military transport to a disease hot zone with 4 hours' notice. The modest apartment they worried about? It was a secure residence near the CDC headquarters, chosen for proximity to work rather than status. While Emma was studying textbook cases in medical school, I'd been implementing real-time responses to actual health crises. During the last pandemic, when the world was struggling to understand transmission patterns and develop containment strategies, I was the one making the decisions that shaped national policy. The protocols Jake mentioned following during his rotation? I'd helped write many of them, sometimes while sitting in makeshift command centers in hazmat suits. My family's assumption that I'd chosen the easier path was particularly painful, because the reality was exactly the opposite. Every day brought life-or-death decisions that affected millions of people. When a new pathogen emerged somewhere in the world, my phone was among the first to ring. When contaminated water threatened entire communities, my teams were deployed within hours. When Congress demanded answers about public health failures, I was the one who faced their questions. Meeting the irony was crushing. They saw my lack of visible wealth and social status as evidence of professional failure, when actually my work demanded a level of discretion and service that left little room for personal luxury. I couldn't post about my achievements on social media because many of my operations were classified. I couldn't bring dates to family functions because my schedule was unpredictable and my work often confidential. I couldn't explain why I sometimes disappeared for weeks because the locations and nature of outbreak responses were sensitive information. Even my exhaustion, which they interpreted as lack of ambition, came from sleepless nights coordinating emergency responses across time zones. The circles under my eyes weren't from a boring desk job. They were from staying awake for 36 hours straight during the anthrax investigation in Denver, or managing the hepatitis outbreak that had threatened to overwhelm 3 state health systems simultaneously. Tonight, sitting at this celebration of Emma's academic achievement, I felt the familiar weight of living 2 lives. In one, I was Dr. Sarah Chen, respected leader in global health, trusted advisor to world leaders, guardian of public safety. In the other, I was just Sarah, the family disappointment, who'd somehow stumbled into a steady government paycheck and learned to be grateful for stability instead of reaching for greatness. The disconnect was exhausting, but it was also necessary. My family's safety depended on their ignorance of my real role, just as much as public health sometimes depended on keeping certain information classified until the right moment. As the dinner conversation shifted to Emma's residency plans, my secure phone vibrated against my wrist with an urgent pattern I'd hoped never to feel during family time. 3 short pulses, pause, 3 more. Emergency protocol activation. My stomach dropped as I discreetly checked the encrypted display under the table. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Outbreak alert, Seattle. Multiple facilities. Immediate containment required. I excused myself to the restroom again, hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. In the privacy of the bathroom, I accessed the full briefing. 15 cases of severe respiratory illness had emerged simultaneously across 3 Seattle hospitals in the past 4 hours. Symptoms were unlike anything in our current surveillance database, and preliminary blood work suggested a novel pathogen with concerning transmission characteristics. This was exactly the scenario that kept me awake at night. A potential pandemic emerging without warning in a major metropolitan area. Even worse, the initial cases included 2 healthcare workers, indicating possible human-to-human transmission. If this outbreak wasn't contained within the next 12 hours, we could be looking at a national emergency that would make the last pandemic seem manageable. I made a quick secure call to Dr. Martinez, my deputy director, who was already en route to the Emergency Operations Center. "How bad is it?" I asked quietly. "Bad enough that we're activating Level 3 protocols," she replied. "We need you back in Atlanta tonight. The samples are being flown to our BSL-4 lab, but Sarah, the clinical presentation is unlike anything we've seen. High fever, respiratory distress, and neurological symptoms appearing within hours of onset." My family was probably wondering where I'd disappeared to, but they had no idea that their underachieving daughter was about to make decisions that could affect millions of lives. The irony was bitter. While they celebrated Emma's entrance into medicine, I was already deep in the trenches of a medical crisis that could define her entire career. "Timeline for preliminary identification?" I asked. 6 hours minimum for basic pathogen typing. But Sarah, there's something else. The index case was a researcher at the University of Washington Virology Lab. This might not be natural emergence. The temperature in the bathroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. A laboratory accident, or worse, intentional release, would transform this from a public health emergency into a national security crisis. Either way, my quiet evening of family disappointment was officially over. I returned to the table, where Emma was enthusiastically describing her rotation in infectious disease medicine to an increasingly engaged Jake. The irony was almost unbearable. She was talking about textbook cases while I was living through what might become the definitive case study of her generation. "Sarah, you look pale," my mother observed with the sharp eye that only mothers possess. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," I replied, calculating how quickly I could extract myself without causing suspicion. My phone was buzzing constantly now with updates from the field teams being deployed to Seattle, but I couldn't check it without drawing attention. Emma continued her animated discussion with Jake about disease surveillance protocols, completely unaware that her sister was currently implementing those exact protocols in real time. "The CDC has these amazing rapid response teams," she was saying. "They can be anywhere in the country within hours of an outbreak notification." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "The coordination must be incredible. Someone has to make those deployment decisions instantly, with incomplete information. I can't imagine the pressure on whoever runs those operations." I nearly choked on my water. The person making those decisions was sitting 3 feet away from him, desperately trying to figure out how to leave this dinner without revealing that a potential biological crisis was unfolding while they discussed theoretical scenarios. My secure phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my chief of staff. "Media picking up Seattle story. Need official statement within 2 hours. Where are you?" The walls were closing in. In less than 2 hours, I would need to be in front of cameras as the public face of the federal response to this outbreak. My family would see me on every news channel, and the carefully constructed fiction of my unremarkable government job would crumble instantly. But first, I had to get to Seattle to assess the situation personally. This wasn't the kind of crisis I could manage remotely from Atlanta. If we were dealing with a novel pathogen, possibly engineered, I needed to see the clinical presentation myself and coordinate with the university lab where this had started. The celebration dinner that was supposed to honor Emma's achievement was about to become the night my family discovered that their biggest disappointment was actually running the most critical public health response in decades. I was trying to formulate an excuse to leave early when Jake pulled out his phone, responding to what Emma had said about CDC protocols. "You know what? Let me show you guys the latest guidelines," he said enthusiastically. "I've been following them religiously during my infectious disease rotation. The CDC website has all the most current outbreak response procedures." My heart stopped. I watched in slow motion as he navigated to the CDC homepage, his finger scrolling through the main navigation. Emma leaned in closer, genuinely interested in seeing the protocols she'd been hearing about in her classes. "Here we go," Jake said, tapping on the leadership section. "I always think it's interesting to see who's actually making these decisions that affect every hospital in the country." The page loaded with the standard executive team photos. At the top, in official government portrait style, was my official headshot alongside my title, Dr. Sarah Chen, Director, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Below it, my credentials were listed in formal government prose that detailed my degrees, my previous positions, and my role overseeing the nation's public health emergency preparedness. Jake's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. First confusion, then recognition, then complete shock. He looked at the phone screen, then at me, then back at the screen. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. "Wait," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "Dr. Chen, you're the CDC director?" The question hung in the air like a live electrical wire. Every conversation at our end of the table stopped instantly. Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth. My mother's wine glass froze at her lips. My father looked up from his conversation with Uncle Robert, drawn by the sudden silence. "What did you say?" Emma asked Jake, confusion clear in her voice. Jake turned his phone around so everyone could see the official CDC webpage, with my photo prominently displayed. "Your sister? She's the director of the CDC. Like, the actual director. The person who runs the entire Centers for Disease Control." Uncle Robert laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke. "That's impossible. Sarah works for some local health department. She doesn't even make enough money to..." His voice trailed off as he looked at the phone screen, then at me, then back at the screen. The official government seal next to my photo left no room for misinterpretation. My mother set down her wine glass with a hand that was visibly shaking. "Sarah," she said quietly, "is this real?" The moment I'd been dreading for 4 years was happening in the worst possible circumstances. Not only was my cover blown, but it was happening while I was trying to manage a potential pandemic. My secure phone was still buzzing with urgent updates from Seattle, but now I had 15 pairs of eyes staring at me in complete disbelief. "Yes," I said simply, "it's real." Emma's study partner was still staring at his phone screen in amazement. "Dr. Chen, I've been reading your papers since sophomore year. Your work on respiratory pathogen transmission during the last pandemic is legendary in medical school. You literally wrote the protocols I've been following." My father's face had gone completely pale. "You're telling me that my daughter, who I thought worked a desk job at some regional health office, is actually running the CDC? The entire CDC?" "For the past 4 years," I confirmed, watching as the reality sank in around the table. Emma looked like she'd been struck by lightning. "Sarah, you've been listening to me talk about infectious disease medicine like I'm teaching you something new, when you're literally the person who sets national policy for infectious disease response?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again with another urgent update from Seattle. The irony was overwhelming. Here I was, finally revealed as the CDC director, while simultaneously managing what could become the biggest public health crisis in recent history. The celebration dinner for Emma's medical school graduation had just become the night my family discovered their failure was actually one of the most powerful people in American public health. And I still had to figure out how to get to Seattle before this outbreak spiraled completely out of control. 20 minutes later, I found myself in an unprecedented situation, conducting an emergency CDC briefing in a private dining room at Meridian restaurant while my family watched in stunned silence. My deputy director, Dr. Martinez, had patched in via secure video call, and Jake, still processing the revelation, had volunteered his laptop for the connection. Dr. Chen, we now have 23 confirmed cases across 4 Seattle hospitals, Martinez reported, her face grave on the laptop screen. Symptom onset is rapid. Average time from exposure to severe illness is under 6 hours. We've never seen anything like this transmission speed. My family sat around the table like spectators at a medical thriller, watching me transform from their disappointing daughter into the person coordinating a national emergency response. Emma's mouth was still slightly open, processing that her sister was receiving real-time briefings on what could become a pandemic. "What's the mortality rate?" I asked, pulling up epidemiological data on my phone while simultaneously texting deployment orders to our rapid response teams. "Too early to determine, but we have 3 patients in critical condition. The concerning factor is that 2 of the original cases were healthcare workers who followed full PPE protocols. Whatever this is, our standard containment measures may not be sufficient." Jake leaned forward, his medical training overriding his shock. "Dr. Chen, may I ask about the clinical presentation? The symptoms you're describing don't match any known respiratory pathogen." I glanced at him, then at my family, making a split-second decision about how much classified information I could share. High fever, rapid onset respiratory distress, and neurological symptoms, including confusion and seizures. The combination suggests either a novel pathogen or a weaponized variant of something we know. My father's face had gone completely white. Weaponized? The index case was a researcher at the University of Washington's Biosafety Laboratory, I explained. "We're investigating whether this was an accidental exposure or something more deliberate." Martinez continued her briefing. "Dr. Chen, we need your authorization to implement Level 4 containment protocols for the entire Seattle metropolitan area. That means travel restrictions, hospital quarantines, and possible evacuation of the university district." The weight of the decision hit me as I looked around the table at my family. Level 4 protocols would affect 3 million people. I would be making decisions that could shut down a major American city based on incomplete information and my professional judgment. "Approved," I said without hesitation. "Deploy teams Alpha, Beta, and Gamma to Seattle. I want full genome sequencing within 12 hours, and coordinate with DoD on potential bioweapon protocols." Emma finally found her voice. "Sarah, you're talking about shutting down Seattle. You have that authority?" "She has more authority than the governor of Washington when it comes to infectious disease containment," Jake said quietly, still staring at my official CDC photo on his phone. "Dr. Chen can override state and local officials during public health emergencies." My mother was gripping her napkin so tightly her knuckles were white. "Sarah, when you say weaponized, do you mean terrorists?" "I mean, we don't know yet," I replied, authorizing another deployment order on my phone. But the clinical presentation and the laboratory connection raise red flags. "We have protocols for both natural emergence and intentional release." Martinez's voice came through the laptop speakers again. "Dr. Chen, the president's been briefed. National Security Council wants a full threat assessment by 0600 tomorrow. And the media is picking up the story. Seattle news stations are reporting mysterious illness at local hospitals." I closed my eyes briefly, calculating the cascade of decisions I needed to make in the next few hours. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. I'll need talking points that don't cause panic but prepare the public for possible containment measures. Uncle Robert, who had been silent since the revelation, finally spoke. "Sarah, you're telling us that you're about to go on national television and tell the country that Seattle might be under biological attack?" "I'm telling you that in the next 24 hours I might have to make decisions that affect millions of lives," I replied. "And until an hour ago you thought I couldn't handle filing government paperwork." The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. They'd spent years pitying my lack of ambition, while I'd been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of crisis. The nightmare scenario that every CDC director hopes never happens but trains for constantly. As I coordinated the largest public health response since the last pandemic, my family finally understood that their failure had actually been carrying the weight of national security on her shoulders, invisible and unrecognized for years. 3 hours later, as I coordinated the Seattle response from my hotel room, the call I'd been dreading came through. "Dr. Amanda Foster, My former mentor and current Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services appeared on my secure video link with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, and utterly without the warmth that had defined our relationship for over a decade. "Sarah," she said, her voice measured and formal, "we need to talk about your handling of the Seattle situation." Something in her tone immediately put me on alert. Foster had been my champion since graduate school, the person who'd recommended me for the CDC fellowship, who'd guided my career through every major promotion. She was supposed to be calling to offer support during this crisis, not to question my decisions. "Amanda, what's wrong?" I asked, studying her face through the screen. "The containment protocols are working. We've identified the pathogen, and we're implementing appropriate countermeasures." "That's exactly the problem," she replied, and I felt the temperature in the room drop. "You implemented Level 4 protocols without consulting the department. You authorized military deployment to a civilian area. You've caused a panic that's affecting markets, travel, and international relations." I stared at her in disbelief. "Amanda, we had a novel pathogen with unknown transmission characteristics, possibly originating from a bioweapons lab. Level 4 was the appropriate response." "Was it?" She leaned forward, her expression hardening. "Or was it an overreaction from someone who's been under tremendous pressure and might not be thinking clearly?" The words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a colleague expressing concern. This was a calculated attack on my professional judgment and mental stability. "What are you saying?" I asked quietly. Foster pulled out a tablet and began reading from what appeared to be an official document. "I'm saying that several members of your senior staff have expressed concerns about your decision-making over the past 6 months. Erratic behavior, isolation from family and friends, decisions made without proper consultation. The Seattle response might be the culmination of a pattern of concerning judgment calls." My blood went cold. I recognized the language. It was the same terminology used in fitness for duty evaluations when an official was being prepared for removal. Someone had been building a case against me, documenting every decision, every moment of stress, every sign of the isolated life that came with running the CDC. "Amanda, you know that's not true. You know me better than anyone in this department." "Do I?" she asked, and her voice carried a tone I'd never heard before. "When was the last time we had a personal conversation, Sarah? When was the last time you seemed like the person I mentored instead of someone consumed by paranoia and control?" The betrayal cut deeper than any professional criticism could have. This woman had been like a second mother to me, had celebrated every promotion, had understood the sacrifices required by this job. Now she was weaponizing my dedication against me. "Nay. I've been doing my job," I said firmly. "And my job requires making difficult decisions with incomplete information under tremendous pressure. Your job also requires judgment and collaboration." The Seattle response demonstrates a concerning pattern of unilateral decision-making that puts you outside the normal chain of command. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a conversation about the Seattle outbreak. This was a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to question my fitness for office. Someone had been preparing for this moment, documenting my behavior, building a case that my isolation and dedication were actually signs of instability. "Amanda, who initiated this evaluation?" She hesitated for just a moment, and in that pause I saw the truth. This wasn't her idea. Someone higher up the chain had instructed her to have this conversation, to plant seeds of doubt about my mental state and professional competence. "The secretary is concerned," she said finally. "There's been talk about whether the pressure of the position has become too much for you." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The Seattle outbreak hadn't just exposed my secret identity to my family. It had also provided the perfect opportunity for someone who wanted me removed to question every aspect of my response. My competence, my judgment, my mental stability were all being challenged at the moment when I most needed institutional support. Someone wanted me gone, and they were using the biggest crisis of my career as the weapon to destroy me. The next morning, I woke up to find my career under systematic assault. The Washington Post headline read, "CDC Director's Mental State Questioned During Seattle Crisis Response." The article, clearly sourced from inside the Department of Health and Human Services, painted a picture of an isolated, paranoid leader who had overreacted to a manageable situation and caused unnecessary panic. The story detailed my pattern of erratic behavior over the past 6 months, citing anonymous sources who described me as increasingly disconnected from my staff and family. It mentioned my failure to maintain normal personal relationships and my obsessive focus on worst-case scenarios that bordered on paranoia. Every aspect of my dedicated service was being reframed as evidence of instability. My late nights at the office became inability to delegate. My security protocols became, quote, paranoid isolation. My quick decision-making during crises became reckless, unilateral action. Even my choice to keep my family uninformed about my work was twisted into evidence that I couldn't maintain healthy relationships. Dr. Martinez called within minutes of the story breaking. "Sarah, this is a coordinated attack. Someone's been feeding information to the press for weeks, building a narrative that you're unfit for duty." "Who?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "It has to be coming from the secretary's office. The details about your decision-making process, your security briefings, your personal habits. This is inside information that only a few people would have access to." The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Just as I was managing the most significant public health crisis in years, someone was systematically undermining my credibility and professional reputation. The Seattle outbreak hadn't just exposed my identity to my family, it had provided the perfect cover for a political assassination. By noon, 3 more articles had appeared in major publications, all carrying the same theme. CDC Director Sarah Chen was a brilliant scientist who had cracked under the pressure of leadership. The stories painted me as a tragic figure who had sacrificed everything for her career and lost perspective in the process. Senator Richard Hayes, chairman of the Health Committee, called for a formal review of my fitness for duty. "The American people deserve leadership that's both competent and stable," he told reporters. Dr. Chen's response to the Seattle situation raises serious questions about her judgment and mental state. The most devastating blow came when my own staff began to distance themselves. Dr. Williams, my communications director, issued a statement saying he had, quote, the decision-making process during the Seattle response. 3 senior epidemiologists requested transfers to other departments, citing, quote, philosophical differences with my leadership style. Each defection was presented as evidence that even my own team had lost confidence in my abilities. The narrative was becoming self-fulfilling. As more people publicly questioned my competence, others felt safer joining the chorus of criticism. Emma called me that afternoon, her voice shaking with anger. "Sarah, I'm watching the news and I can't believe what they're saying about you. Jake and I both know you saved lives in Seattle. Your response was exactly what they teach us in medical school." "The truth doesn't matter right now," I told her. "Someone wants me gone, and they're using every tool at their disposal to make it happen." "But why? You're the most qualified person for this job. Your track record speaks for itself." I thought about that question as I watched my reputation being dismantled in real time. Why, indeed? The Seattle outbreak response had been textbook perfect. We'd contained a potentially catastrophic situation with minimal casualties. My protocols had worked exactly as designed. The answer was becoming clear. Someone didn't want a CDC director who was willing to make hard decisions without political approval. They wanted someone more controllable, more willing to consider political consequences before public health imperatives. My independence, the very quality that made me effective during crises, had also made me a target. In a government increasingly focused on political optics over scientific reality, a CDC director who prioritized public health above all else was seen as a liability. As I prepared for what I knew would be the fight of my professional life, I realized that the real battle wasn't about my mental state or fitness for duty. It was about whether scientific leadership could survive in an increasingly politicized environment. The question wasn't whether I was competent to do my job. It was whether anyone would be allowed to do this job the way it was meant to be done. The Senate Health Committee hearing room was packed to capacity, with camera crews from every major news network positioned around the perimeter. I sat alone at the witness table, facing a semicircle of senators who held my career in their hands. Behind me, In the public gallery, I could see my family, Emma, my parents, even Uncle Robert, sitting in the front row with expressions of fierce determination. Senator Hayes opened the hearing with his characteristic theatrical flair. Dr. Chen, this committee has received troubling reports about your conduct during the recent Seattle outbreak. We're here today to determine whether you remain fit to serve as director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I had prepared for this moment for weeks, gathering evidence, documenting every decision, building a case not just for my competence but for the integrity of science-based public health leadership itself. Senator Hayes, I began, my voice steady despite the cameras and lights. I welcome this opportunity to present the facts about the Seattle response and to address the systematic campaign that has been waged against evidence-based decision-making in public health. I activated the presentation screen behind me, displaying a timeline of the Seattle outbreak response. At 6:47 p.m. on the evening in question, CDC surveillance systems detected anomalous disease patterns in Seattle area hospitals. By 8:15 p.m., we had confirmed a novel pathogen with characteristics suggesting potential bioweapon origins. Senator Patricia Williams, one of the few physicians on the committee, leaned forward. Dr. Chen, can you walk us through your decision-making process for implementing Level 4 containment protocols? Absolutely. I clicked through slides showing infection rates, transmission patterns, and laboratory analysis. Level 4 protocols require 3 criteria: novel pathogen with unknown transmission characteristics, potential for rapid spread, and inadequate conventional containment measures. Seattle met all 3 criteria within the first 4 hours. But Dr. Chen, Senator Hayes interrupted, you implemented these protocols without consulting the Secretary's office or considering the economic impact on the region. I turned to face him directly. Senator, with respect, public health emergencies don't wait for bureaucratic approval. Every hour of delay in implementing containment measures could have resulted in exponential case growth. My job is to save lives, not to protect stock prices. The room fell silent. I could see several senators shifting uncomfortably as the weight of my words settled in. Furthermore, I continued, the so-called economic panic that my critics cite resulted in exactly 0 business closures, 0 job losses, and 0 long-term economic impact. What it did result in was the complete containment of a potentially catastrophic outbreak within 72 hours. Senator Maria Gonzalez, a former emergency room physician, spoke next. Dr. Chen, we've heard testimony suggesting that your decision-making has become increasingly isolated and erratic. How do you respond to these characterizations? I had been waiting for this question. Senator, I'd like to address that directly by sharing some context about the nature of CDC leadership that I believe has been misrepresented. I displayed a new slide showing my schedule from the previous month. In the last 30 days, I've worked an average of 14 hours per day, 7 days a week. I've coordinated responses to 12 disease outbreaks across 4 countries, testified before Congress 6 times, and briefed the president on emerging threats 3 times. The room was completely quiet now, all attention focused on my presentation. The isolation my critics describe is actually the focused dedication required to monitor global health threats in real time. When I miss family dinners, it's because I'm on a secure call with the WHO about an Ebola outbreak in Central Africa. When I seem disconnected from normal social interactions, it's because I'm processing classified intelligence about bioterrorism threats. I clicked to my final slide, showing a world map with dozens of red dots marking active CDC operations. This is what the CDC monitors every single day. Every red dot represents a potential threat to American public health. My job is not to be popular or politically convenient. My job is to stand between the American people and these threats, regardless of the personal cost. Emma was crying in the gallery, finally understanding the full weight of what her sister had been carrying alone for years. The question before this committee, I concluded, is not whether I'm the most socially well-adjusted person in Washington. The question is whether you want a CDC director who makes decisions based on scientific evidence and public health imperatives, or one who prioritizes political approval over protecting American lives. The silence that followed was deafening. The committee deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, Senator Williams spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of both a physician and a legislator. Dr. Chen, after reviewing the evidence and testimony, this committee finds that your response to the Seattle outbreak was not only appropriate but exemplary. You demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that protects American lives. Senator Hayes looked visibly uncomfortable as the ranking member continued. Furthermore, we are deeply troubled by the apparent coordinated effort to undermine your credibility during a public health emergency. Such actions put politics above public safety and cannot be tolerated. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones while cameras captured my moment of vindication. But the real victory came when I saw my family's faces in the gallery. Emma was sobbing with relief, my mother was applauding through tears, and even my father was wiping his eyes. Within hours, the truth began to emerge. An internal investigation revealed that Deputy Secretary Foster had been working with pharmaceutical lobbyists who wanted a more industry-friendly CDC director. The same companies that would have profited from a delayed response to Seattle had been funding the campaign against my leadership. Dr. Martinez called with the news I'd been waiting for. "Sarah, Foster just submitted her resignation. And the 3 staff members who spoke against you? Turns out they were all promised positions at private consulting firms with ties to the pharmaceutical industry." The vindication was swift and complete. Editorial boards across the country condemned the political interference in public health leadership. The president issued a statement expressing full confidence in my leadership and announcing new protections for CDC independence. My family gathered that evening at my parents' house in Portland for what Emma called a proper celebration dinner. This time, there were no awkward silences or disappointed looks. Uncle Robert, humbled and apologetic, raised his glass first. "To Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I spent years thinking you'd given up on your dreams, when you were actually living the most important dream any of us could imagine. I'm sorry it took a Senate hearing for me to see what was right in front of me." My mother stood next, tears streaming down her face. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Not just for what you do, but for who you are. You saved lives while we were worried about appearances, and you never once made us feel small for not understanding." Emma was the last to speak. "Sarah, you've been my hero this whole time, even when I was too stupid to realize it. Thank you for showing me what real medicine looks like. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't have to hide who I was or apologize for the choices I'd made. My family finally understood that their disappointment had actually been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and they were ready to help share that load." 6 months later, I stood at the podium in the CDC's main auditorium, addressing a packed room of epidemiologists, public health officials, and medical students from across the country. The occasion was the launch of the new Public Health Leadership Excellence Program, designed to train the next generation of crisis response leaders. In the front row sat Emma, now completing her infectious disease residency, and Jake, who had changed his specialty focus to epidemiology after witnessing the Seattle response firsthand. Behind them, my parents beamed with pride as they finally understood the scope of the work their daughter had been doing in silence for years. The Seattle outbreak taught us that public health leadership requires more than scientific expertise, I began, my voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium. It requires the courage to make unpopular decisions, the integrity to resist political pressure, and the resilience to continue serving even when that service goes unrecognized. The audience included several faces I recognized from my darkest days. Former critics who had publicly apologized once the truth about the coordinated campaign against me became clear. The pharmaceutical lobby's involvement had been exposed in a series of investigative reports that led to congressional hearings and industry reforms. Dr. Martinez, now promoted to deputy director, introduced the first class of fellowship recipients. Among them was a young woman from Oregon whose application essay had moved me to tears. She wrote about wanting to be the kind of leader who saves lives from the shadows, just like the CDC director she'd learned about during the Seattle crisis. After the ceremony, my family joined me for dinner at a small restaurant near the CDC campus. The conversation was relaxed, natural. No more awkward silences or disappointed glances. They asked detailed questions about my work, genuinely interested in understanding the complexities of global disease surveillance and emergency response. "Sarah," my father said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, "I need to say something. For years, I measured success by the wrong standards. I thought achievement meant being visible, making money, getting recognition. I never understood that the most important work often happens where no one can see it." Emma nodded emphatically. "Working in infectious disease now, I see your influence everywhere. The protocols we follow, the rapid response procedures, the international coordination networks. Your fingerprints are on all of it. You've been saving lives on a scale I never imagined." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry it took us so long to see you, really see you. You were protecting people while we were worried about wedding invitations and family photos." As we walked back to the parking garage, Emma linked her arm through mine. "You know what's funny? Jake still brings up that dinner sometimes. He says it was the moment he realized medicine was bigger than individual patients, that public health heroes work behind the scenes to protect millions of people who never know their names." The work continues, as it always will. There are new threats emerging, new outbreaks to monitor, new crises requiring swift, decisive action. But now I face these challenges with something I hadn't had for years: the unqualified support of a family who finally understands that being invisible doesn't mean being unimportant. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from standing guard in the shadows, protecting those who will never know you saved them. Sometimes being misunderstood is the price of doing what's right. And sometimes, when the truth finally emerges, it illuminates not just your own worth, but the value of every person who chooses service over recognition, duty over comfort, and saving lives over being seen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.